Hi, welcome to SHOWstudio's live panel discussions, where industry experts come together to talk about today's influential fashion. Today we'll be looking at Pitti Uomo's guest designers, Bologna-born brand Magliano, and London's very own Daley. But before I get into it, I want my gorgeous panel to introduce themselves, starting with the end.
Hello, I'm Otamere Guobadia. I am a writer and author, and I am excited to be here.
My name is David Curtis-Ring. I'm a set designer and artist, and also really happy to be here for this great panel.
I'm Bimini. Apparently I'm an industry expert, which is great. And I work as an artist, and yeah.
I'm happy to be here.
Thanks.
I'm Amy. I'm a journalist and the deputy editor of the Basic magazine. Happy to be here.
Everyone's eyes.
Making us say it.
Why do you have a saying this at gunpoint?
Awesome, amazing. So today, the jumping off point is really Pitti's guest designers, Magliano and Daley. But really what we want to talk about is menswear, the future of menswear, what it looks like. And before we look at the collections, I kind of want to ask you guys, how are we defining menswear right now? How do we see menswear right now? In the last decade, it's been such a flux of different interpretations of it, post-Me Too, with queer culture taking over the zeitgeist the way it has. So where do you see it right now?
It's so difficult, isn't it? Because I think you also have to examine what does it mean to be a man, I guess, or what is, where it's a gender binary to begin with, I guess. So then you have to think about how we broaden that concept of what a man is or can be or might be. And I think that's a really interesting question that I'm not sure I even know the answer to, actually. So, yeah.
I think a lot of it to do with societal pressure or the conventions of what has been created to be a man. So even if you look at the history of menswear throughout different cultures, there's a cultural difference, there can be historical difference, like heels being originally for men, and kings wearing them to be more grander, or like even like the gladiators wearing those little like sexy mini skirts, because they looked good. But I feel like there's the conversation, it all comes down to like, I guess a lot of it fragility in a way and conformity, because most people do want to conform, and I think you'd rather fit in and be accepted as what it is to be one or the other than kind of defy it. But I think with fashion, you can defy it, and I think people do. So that's always really interesting.
Yeah, I think the main thing that has changed is kind of this approach to it, where it's not necessarily about the clothing, but the culture to it. And it's about, I don't know, there's more playfulness and experimentation. And I think that it's kind of cleared out a lot of preconceived notions of what, the binaries of what a man or a woman should wear. And it kind of has allowed for this space where, people can try things on and see if it works for them and how they want to present to the world and the attitude they want to give off. And, modern menswear isn't just the fact that, like a man could wear a skirt. It's the fact that there is like the ability for your masculinity not to be in question or threatened because other people are. And I think, there's just like more basis for openness and acceptance and just playfulness.
It's interesting. I think we're 10 years on from, I guess, the infamous Gucci collection, which we're going to talk about. And in so many ways, I think that time is a flat circle. In something such as fashion, it is so evident. I think that the actual material, the actual substance of what we're talking about, perhaps the gender deviance being high profile within fashion, the acceptance of that. It's actually interesting because I think that while you are seeing perhaps more men in dresses, or you're seeing more people, I actually think that it's slow, but I think the trend is actually trending away from that kind of gender deviance. I think that I'm seeing, and even in my own personal style, I'm seeing a trend towards a kind of more formalized expression of menswear again. I think that we're going to talk about this, but in all of the new collections, I think if you compare them to what we saw 10 years ago, I actually think you're seeing a lot more ties, a lot more things that are dating to formal wear in the across the 20th, 18th to like sort of 21st century. I think we're actually seeing a return to that, which I think is like is an interesting response to what's happening, I think, in politics, more globally, politics, even locally, politics within the United Kingdom. I think, like, even if you look at the conversations that happen with comedians with regard to masculinity and with regards to, emasculation, I think that we're seeing a real-time backlash, and we're seeing fashion actually, menswear in particular, respond to that. I think that, there are still, those elements within it are interesting and perhaps, blur that line. But I actually think that we're moving away from this kind of like, sort of gender-bending, perhaps utopia we were promised in advance. We're actually moving in a far more traditional direction.
I completely agree, and I think that loops us right into this conversation of contextualizing Pitti Uomo. Pitti Uomo started in 1952 to really establish artisanal Florentine craft in menswear. I have a couple TikToks from Pitti this year that kind of really shows that hegemonic idea of Pitti as a menswear mecca. This is what I think of when I think Pitti and Italian menswear. That point to conservatism within menswear today as a response I find really interesting, especially with these two designers, because both Magliano and SS Daley have made it quite explicit that they're queer designers. They're queer designers who tap into their own queer identity and notions of queer desire, and that really weaves both of them together. Aesthetically, I think they couldn't be more different.
I definitely think there's a playfulness with these designers and what they do and how they take on that formality or more the formal wear and can add the feminine to it as well, like the touch of both. I think it's done really well. There's a playfulness to it.
So this is Magliano's Autumn-Winter 2023 collection, and I really interpreted it as him playing with the everyday realities of the world that he grew up in. All of these feel like figures that he would have interacted with in some way, straight down to the plastic carrier bags. What do we think about this collection on first view?
It feels very filmic, and I think he refers to wanting it to feel like cinema, actually. And I think that really comes across is that each of these people look like identities. They look like characters. They look like they have a life and a personality. Each one is different, but they all sort of feel like they belong to the cast from a film or
Home Alone.
and as well
Shade, but
the staging as well, is very cinematic and it feels very filmic.
Yeah.
Cinematic.
So it was at the Nelson Mandela Forum in Florence, and it was probably his biggest show yet. So Magliano is just off the heels of winning LVMH's Karl Lagerfeld Prize this season, and SS Daley actually won the LVMH prize a couple years ago. So these are both really young designers at really still early stages in their careers. I think both of them are around the 5-year mark, who are really being championed by the industry for what they have to say. Do we see enough of what Magliano is trying to get across in this collection?
I think it's interesting to see kind of certain uses of kind of layering, for example. How like there's the kind of cardigan over the shirt with the kind of almost like skirt almost. It like brings in that kind of slight level of femininity, but the clothing itself is almost, it's like you're kind of a heightened or more elevated version of like the everyday outfit or like everything you wear. But I wonder for me if those little elements wouldn't, because a lot of these people, I'd say a lot of this can come down to like a class culture, and it can be like maybe working class people would necessarily wear more fits like this on an everyday basis than like a more high kind of like formal suit and jacket and everything. I think it's because it's all like oversized and relaxed. But I wonder if the translation would mix with the working class with those little elements of femininity. I don't know, because Do you know what I mean? With the the oversized and the kind of slouched and relaxed fit, I think feels quite streetwear-y.
Yeah, because I know that he's talked about in a lot of interviews about how there is this real queer community that he feels is not really given a language or a platform or even an image to, and he really tries to speak to that with the clothes. And I know with this collection he was really talking about looking at those classic silhouettes and garments that you associate with menswear, and then I think he was like re-queering them and sort of adding these, as you said, these like little feminine touches and these twists and these things that, I don't know, especially it's so hard because when you see it as an image, it's never quite when you're like up close with these clothes, and they actually, when you see them being worn and how they sort of fall on people, like especially this, like the way that's kind of off-shouldering, falling, and like the tank top kind of off, it's I think especially in real life, you can really see that it is this sort of subtle signifier that maybe doesn't pick up as much in an image, but you really do get when you see the clothes IRL on people.
I really see his work, and I think the industry really has reverence for him so early on in how he romanticizes the everyday, how he finds beauty in the things that he was surrounded with. And I think that does come down to this very mundane working class aesthetic and finding real beauty in that.
Because it's a magic realism, I think, which is really kind of present, I think, in those images.
I mean, I think it also plays with our expectations, like seeing, these are all, I'm pretty sure, all street cast models. Seeing one older gentleman in a kitty intarsia, like knit with sequin trousers.
Yeah, that.
I think that's
great.
kind of amazing, right?
Again, when it comes down to this kind of style, like I love fashion as an expression. I love fashion as an art. I love people using it as such. But I feel like this kind of style, I'd love to see filter into kind of smaller areas in the UK, for example. But I feel like it would, a lot of the time, this kind of more, it would be seen in like Middle England as like an eccentric style. It wouldn't kind of be seen around there. Like they'd probably kind of mock the person for wearing that, you know, or they wouldn't feel. I know coming from a small town, I felt very like ostracized, and I didn't really feel like I could wear or express myself. So I feel like this would be kind of seen in different cities, but I don't know how much it would translate everywhere, you know?
I agree with you. I mean, I think people as well, once you get outside of London even, are much more conservative than you expect. I mean, I grew up in Birmingham, and I remember once being nearby a local like shopping area nearby to where I lived, and having green trousers and just someone shouting, "Green trousers!" Like, as if it was wild, you know, like to wear green trousers was...
Yeah, if you were in Norfolk in a pair of sequin trousers.
Wouldn't
go down well.
This isn't to be controversial, because I think that like the clothes are like, I think they're beautiful. I think they're like devastatingly chic and very elevated. But I also like, I mean, I love Look 38. I think Look 38 is incredible and fantastic. But I guess my thing is, there's also, to me, there's not much that is ostensibly queer about it, which maybe is evidence of how much, you know, progress we've made. I think that there's something really, really, you know, pared back. You know, I feel like it's the very antithesis of like the campness that we've come to like associate with queerness. But also, I do think it's very, very elevated. I actually don't think that there's very much of the street about it. I think it's so refined and so, you know, it's like the quotidian refined to like the nth degree. And I think that like for that, it's like stunningly well done, but it doesn't necessarily excite me. I think the clothes are beautiful, but I don't find it to be the most exciting thing. And so I guess my question is like, you know, when we're talking about like queer designers, like what are we talking about? Are we talking about a politic? Are we talking about a mindset that filters through into the work? Are we talking about work that is visibly and ostensibly, you know, queer coded, you know, through the symbols that we've like learnt and the symbols that like have been acculturated into queer culture? And so, you know, it's interesting.
I agree with you.
But is it queer?
You don't see the queer.
No, I don't.
The only way I would even think about that is queerness.
Someone came and told me that this is a collection by a queer designer, which I guess maybe that is in itself is subversive, just that a queer designer has reached this level and they're creating work. But I think to talk about the work being queer or having this like queer countercultural, element to it, and for it to be so subtle, I'm wondering.
For me, with that point, I think what I took from it is like the queerness, and I'm kind of the opposite end of this. It's like, as you can see. But for me, maybe like those oversized fits and those traditional kind of garments covered up. It's like queerness, as in a queer identity, you have to be. It's very difficult to express your queer identity or find that. And what is queerness? Like, what does it mean to be queer? So maybe their take on that, their level of queerness is the shame and that being covered up and hidden, being like things oversized and almost like hugging you too much, or because you're scared to come out or anything. So I think but for me, I'm like, no, my queerness is wearing no clothes. So it's like the opposite. But I like
that's how I kind of viewed this collection. It was almost tinged with his ideas on queer identity and desire. But before we get into that, we have to go to the opposite end of the spectrum, which is SS Daley's Winter 23 collection.
That's what my bias will show.
Which is very different. It's a lot
romantic.
more. It's romantic. It's
I'm on trend.
but Stephen has always kind of looked to British institutions and academia as his primary inspiration, as homosocial spaces where queer desire can present itself, but then gets removed once you've removed yourself from these institutions. He's really queering that history through the clothing. What are your impressions of this collection?
I love this. I think it's really beautiful. I like little details that there are in some certain things to just bring in that femininity, even just like, I don't know, like the oversized collars and little like ruffles, or even the animals that are featured, like sheep, like they're cute little sheep. Like that's
there's
quite.
Humour in it,
there's humour. Yeah, it's not taking itself too seriously, but it's also very refined.
And I love that it kind of takes place in this dormitory, and it feels very morning after. Like there's people not even wearing pants, and like these kind of throw blanket ponchos. And I really like that he's, in past collections he's kind of looked at sort of changing rooms and sports, and I like that he's now gone into the dormitory. And one of the show notes was talking about how he was reading this diary of a person who was in Oxford, and it was talking about how he was always in this Eliot's room, and when they always say, oh, they'll be remembered in history as best friends, and like kind of all these sort of reinterpretations of these places in these elite boarding schools that do kind of have these very suppressed homoeroticness to it that we kind of have to relentlessly see in a different lens to kind of remove it from what it is. And I really loved this collection. I thought it was great.
It takes from the academia and the kind of like upper class or higher class systems, but it's undone. It's like not what you'd normally see. Like everything's what I love, like the kind of almost the singed waist as well, and a lot of things I think is really kind of a beautiful touch. And obviously, like for a more masculine body, a singed waist with broaden shoulders, and that throughout history that's been used as such. But then I think that became less common in like your everyday, even like working class men's suit, for example. Like.
There is a real irreverence in how he plays with uniform, which I think makes the clothes feel easy and desirable. I think I love every look in this.
Yeah. I love the nipples out.
Also, just from a tailoring standpoint, I think that like he's really stepped up like the proportions, and I think, for example, that the sort of dressing gown, but it's almost like it's much from Chaya. It's one of the earlier. No, even that I think is fantastic, because he's always played with this sort of like across the seasons played with this like sort of these like dressing gowns and these like really like beautiful prints. But yes, like look at number 2, for example. I think that the proportions of that I just think are brilliant. And I think for me anyway, like fashion is about fantasy, and I think that like, I think that he absolutely like reaches for it. I think that, the things that he's trying to conjure up, I think that the connection is easily made, and I don't think that necessarily means that it's it's a better collection or it's more valuable. But I can see the lineage. I could see straight from E.M. Forster. I can see Morris. I can see all of that, like even all the way up until E.M. Forster's death in the 70s. I think it's I think it's a beautiful collection. I love these like sort of like almost like knitted polo muumuu moments.
Yeah.
I think there's something about them that feels so pastoral, but also
like a rugby
so
shirt.
Mickle, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It feels very, it just feels very,
Or a blanket.
a little bit Micklemas, like very, I don't know, it just something about it is.
See, good use of tones as well, I think, of that.
Yeah.
And the proportion, I think, is perfect from like the collar to like the length. I think it works so well, and I think it's like such an interesting evolution of the knitwear that Stephen's had in like previous iterations. I think this is my favorite like work.
I think for me the strength of this and also the strength of the Magliano collection is the sense of storytelling, so that you the sum is greater than its parts, kind of, so that you see these as individual looks that might be desirable that you want to wear or that you admire for their kind of technical ability, but seeing them as a whole really starts to tell a story. And I would say that while Magliano is very cinematic, this always feels very kind of storybook to me with Stephen's collections.
There's a point of view.
Yeah, totally.
Which is evident, and I think that's something a lot of the time I think is missing nowadays in shows, because there's less of, I don't know, not theatrics, I don't mean that, but like there's a story, there's a narrative, there's a meaning, rather than just like trying to sell a garment, sell the clothes,
There's personalities rather than anonymous models walking down.
And all the greatest shows were like that. The most fun ones I can think of from the 90s, for example, like when there was personality and it was free, and that's what, fashion, the fantasy element, like you said.
I think looking at SS Daley, obviously there is that fantasy dream escapism to the collection and to the presentation. But I have the question of, we kind of toed around Magliano maybe not being as queer as we would hope from a queer designer. And I'm wondering, is there a difference between who can be explicitly queer in their identity and how they express themselves? If we think about Magliano really looking to the everyday and working class, and there's a tinge of queerness to his ideas rather than Stephen's inspiration and allowing it to take the forefront.
I think what's really interesting is that Stephen once said that he comes from a working class background, and there's always these weird charges against him, like, are you fetishizing Tory culture? And he was like, which I think is like a really weird charge. But what I find really interesting is he's like, as someone from a working class background, in these public institutions, a lot of the things that are really normal, like theatre and arts, and like these very like over-the-top rituals and like excessiveness, he would be persecuted for being really into from his social circles. And he's someone that has been really into theatre, like he went to theatre school. And I think it's really interesting because obviously with Magliano being about more that everyday workwear influence, which even Stephen has said that I would be persecuted for these things. It's like, I feel like already the world that Stephen is so inspired by and looking at, it already has that sense of theatrics that you can play off. There's more fantasy that's allowed, and I think maybe with Magliano, where he's going somewhere where it has traditionally had more of a guard up against certain things, I think, it's an interesting, juxtaposition looking at that both and like seeing sort of where that sense of play is allowed or even contained.
Well, it's a subversive take on something they didn't have access to, which I think is really interesting.
Well, I think it really speaks to the fact that progress has been made, but has it for everyone in all instances, right?
There's an there's an escapism, which is kind of what you were saying, Amy. Basically, whereas Magliano sort of returns to the culture that he's from and the working class culture that he's from and kind of queers it, Stephen seems to find escapism and freedom in a more liberal, leisurely kind of class, basically, whereas Magliano is about the working class, and you really feel that it's the the clothing of a working people, whereas with Stephen's work, it's more
leisure. It's clothing of the leisure classes.
Yeah.
It's about parties. It's about laying in late. It's about just getting up, you know. And
There's like an elegant flamboyance to this, which those circles could get away with more than a working
Very Noel Coward, like it's very, which I adore. I like, you know, I think that's fun. It's a world that like he like continues to like reach into and perfect. And yeah, someone who mentioned the children's storybook element, like definitely, I absolutely get that. Like Lady Bird, it's like an imagined timeline, like the Lady Bird fashion.
With the conversation on class divide and queer desire, I feel like we should talk about Saltburn. Because these are the themes that have so resonated with everyone on the Twitter and TikTok feed that it's all anyone can talk about. And seeing these two young designers really play up both ends of the spectrum simultaneously, essentially, I find really interesting, especially when we talk about today's masculinity.
I think the wider conversation around queerness, I think there is a queer desire and there is a queer almost lust or fetishization in a way of that. But then I don't know if there's a full valid definition of what queer is. Like, I feel queer, but it's not defined by my sexuality, it's defined by my attitude towards the way I view the world because of how I've been treated. It's almost like I feel like queer is like a bit of a new punk in a way, you know, like how punk was a movement to stand against something. I feel like being queer and accepting that and reclaiming that and taking that back, I don't know if there's like one full set definition of it, if you understand, like
outsider kind of in a way.
Yeah, because I think it's about deviating from like social norms or doing what's within you. And I feel like a lot of the time, like I said earlier about conformity, it's easier to conform than to be queer. So I think it's a difficult one to understand because again, and a friend of mine actually made this really good point earlier, is the fetishization of like queerness and being able to wear a dress, for example. Harry Styles on the cover of Vogue, great, but the person walking down the road is probably going to get some stuff said to them, you know? But like Harry Styles is kind of someone whose sexuality isn't defined, or we don't talk about that. It's kind of like almost the queer baiting element to it, which
And you have some really great.
God, you open up the queer basic conversation once more. Oh God, for a second I thought that was the piece I wrote. No, it's interesting actually. I think there are a few there are so many big questions, right? Is queerness a political project? Is it a label? Is it about self-definition? Is it about subversion? Is it about deviation from norms? Is it something that like we are pushed to identify with it? Is it the identification of the absence of something? It's interesting. Is there a queer look? Is there not a queer look? And I think that ultimately none of these questions have like an easy, clear-cut answer. But I suppose that the point about Harry Styles is always an interesting one and a good one. And it's an interesting conversation, partly because we think of Harry Styles as someone who in some way benefits from queer imagery or from the queer countercultural without, paying his dues. I think that's perhaps a narrow way to look at it, because I think, first of all, like, as we've said, the queer politic behind those two collections that we looked at, ostensibly one might appear to be more visually queer, or might associate one might term to be more visually queer, but is it a more radical politic? Is it or is it just, is it still a valorization of the establishment and of establishment aesthetics? That's another question, And I feel like with Harry Styles, ultimately, the relationship that most people have to one of the most famous men in the world is deeply parasocial. I think we have no true, like epistemological knowledge of Harry Styles' personal sexuality, and neither do we have any right to it. And I think that I understand the frustrations of queer people worldwide who think we have suffered, we have paid in our blood you know, to walk down the streets in these clothes, and here you are on red carpets, you know, and on magazine covers without giving us any sort of, you know, like kudos. And I understand that pain, but you cannot bottle or lay claim to queer aesthetics, to the queer countercultural, because you will always end up reinforcing the very, you know, the very boxes on this continuum of experience while trying to, you know, trying to define who may or may not identify as queer, who may or may not have these aesthetics. They don't belong to any of us.
And actually, if you look at this, for example, Harry Styles wearing this, I mean, it's interesting to me that this would have been quite as controversial today as it was when we have had so many artists throughout history, or throughout the last even like 60 years, people like Bowie and like, you know, Prince, and how they would dress, and like it was, and a lot of artists would use fashion that was feminine or androgynous and play around with it. And to me, Harry Styles, the fact that it's just on the cover of Vogue, I guess, is the groundbreaking element, but to me the outfit and Harry wearing it isn't particularly that groundbreaking. Because also, like, I think as a queer person, finding my identity, it was a real struggle, and it's constantly changing and evolving, and like, I agree with you, because there's a gatekeeping almost, in a way. Like, should Harry Styles be allowed to do that? Yes, of course. But then we, as queer people, shouldn't be ostracized for how we dress on every day, because that's the conversation inside society that is the tricky one to navigate, because people can wear what they want. That's ultimately what it come down to. We should be allowed to wear what we want and not feel repercussions for that.
It's actually a quote by Magliano I wrote down because I really liked it. Gender is an open conversation that needs as many representatives as human beings are, which I thought.
I think that's entirely right. I think, like, a friend of mine and a sort of like writer and like queer thinker, Ben Vile, they've spoken about the fact that, like, you know, you want, as painful as it might be to see other people receive praise, you know, for what is subversive, ultimately you want as many gender deviants, you want as many people rebelling against, you know, the binaries and the strictures, and many people pushing the label on the spectrum, because that is the way in which, you know, like, freedom for all of us from the constraints, like even in just as narrow a field as fashion. That is one way in which, like, people will be freed if there is a multiplicity of gender expressions, a multiplicity of relationships to gender, and not just like the many or the obvious or the binary. And I think that, like, you know, the end result is that people always end up in these conversations forced out of the closet, you know, be it with Kit, or you know, or they feel compelled to make some sort of statement because their queerness is being called into things. And I think that ultimately what people struggle with I guess with Harry Styles and with actors sometimes is they feel that, like, these roles are being taken from queer, like, actors who are openly queer and who are typecast, but then don't get the roles because, you know, someone high profile gets to do it. And I guess that ultimately that's really what people are upset about and unjust about, is a labor issue. Like queer actors should not have to struggle in the labor market as much as they do. But I think to demand that, like, you know, everyone who acts in your film or wears a dress be a card-carrying, public identifying member of, you know, of Homosexuals Incorporated is not really.
I think it really circles back to how do we define what queer is and what it should mean. Does queer have to be radical? Does it have to be pioneering and boundary pushing always? Harry Styles invested a minority stake in SS Daley. That was the big news right before the show. So he's really, I think, putting his money where his mouth is, being inspired by this queer designer, and has really championed Steven since the beginning, and is now actively propelling the brand to become the next big heritage house. How do we feel about that?
No, I think it's incredible. I think it's like really great. Putting his money where his mouth is, which I think is, you know, as much as the politics of the gestural matter and the symbolic, I think that actually, you know, like, supporting this brand through, like, you know, it's always a difficult time in fashion, but it's a difficult time in fashion. So, you know, I think it's actually a meaningful thing, a meaningful gesture.
Yeah, I think it's really beautiful to kind of feel like the investment in there. But interestingly enough, when I saw this collection first and foremost, as beautiful and elegant as it is, I don't personally know many queers that would dress like this on the everyday. For me, this is a Harry Styles version of that, in a way, you know? Like, it's accessible for kind of someone of a stature or someone of a higher societal... But I feel like... Do you feel like queer queers, I feel like the rebellious nature some queers have about pushing boundaries or trying to do certain things, and then people catch up almost, you know?
Yeah.
It's almost like a 10-year rule.
Well, speaking about 10-year rules, before I get to audience questions, I wanted to talk briefly about Gucci, because the new creative director just presented his first menswear collection for the show. Roughly 10 years after Alessandro Michele presented that really boundary-pushing, androgynous. This, to me, really shifted menswear, and it shifted culture in general.
Shook the table.
It did. I think it really propelled these queer conversations to happen in the mainstream and what men and women can express themselves as. Jumping to Sabato's menswear collection, which he played on the women's wear collection he presented earlier, but they are still separate collections. There's still that clear-cut dichotomy between menswear and women's wear. So yeah, this is about a decade post that. Do we think this is the direction that menswear is really heading in? Again, we talked about menswear becoming more conservative and becoming more
It's reformalizing
in the classics.
Yeah, I think it's definitely it's reformalizing. It's like, I wouldn't call it night and day, but yeah, I mean it's absolutely reformalizing. Look, like matching like monogrammed gloves with like, you know, like a suit in that like heritage print. I think it's reformalizing. I think that is like a direct response. I even think that, like, you know, Michele's exit from Gucci, I think symbolizes where we are with fashion, but also a series of high-profile exits. You know, think about like Ludovic leaving and Milsa, like all of these perhaps like queer, more subversive, like, you know, like gender-bending elements, like giving, like, you know, camp elements, giving birth to, you know, this like reformalization, this movement towards this like sort of conservative, like trend back towards very formal menswear. And I think that's, I think as masculinity, and I think that the suit is an interesting thing actually, because, you know, you think of suits, but many men think of suits now when they think of, you know, like Andrew Tate, and they think of like, you know, I think that there is definitely a reappropriation, a move towards this suit and the tie as a kind of like, you know, masculine armor, as a symbol of like virility, as a symbol of like, you know, of like this modern man. I feel like it's happening again, you know. I think that's absolutely that. The layer, look at the layering, the shirts, like all of that.
It's returning back to this hegemonic archetype of what
a man is and what a man should wear.
And I will say, for me, it has been a bit disappointing seeing this shift go back towards this after we had Michele really kind of revolutionize gender and fashion.
I think it's economical as well.
And yeah.
I think it comes down to what's happening in the world, in the zeitgeist. And I think after COVID, there was a moment where everyone just went for it and was like, but now everyone's like, the financial and economics of the world is in kind of a different state. And I think it reflects that, you know, when there's turmoil financially, I think dress sense is kind of smartened up, or whereas like when people have more money to be free, then they're like dressed like more flamboyant or extravagant or fun or free. Like it's a kind of level of restriction to it almost, I think, with what's happening politically too.
Which I think circles back to my point of who can be implicit or explicit in how they present themselves. S.S. Daley's aristocratic inspired flamboyance versus Magliano's realistic view on culture as a whole. Audience questions. I have a good one. Has Harry Styles changed menswear for the better or the worse?
Sorry.
This man invented wearing clothes.
I do not wish to comment.
Like I said earlier, like that's like a queer take, but it's not. I don't necessarily see this as changing the face of menswear, because I don't think the average, like, especially because of the way they're presenting. So, for an example, with myself, if I don't have certain elements to my look, for example, a wig, and I'm walking down the road in this outfit, people don't get it. So then that's when I've had like a lot more abuse hurled at me, as opposed to when I've got a wig on and there's this full, like head to toe, like kind of thing, people can get it. People like to box people in. So I don't know if this is going to allow the average man to go down, or especially working class, to go to a working men's club in a dress, you know?
What I will say is that, not for me personally, but he is arguably the biggest heartthrob in the world. And it is, like arguably, and it is interesting that, you know, if you look at how heartthrobs were presented 10, 20 years ago, it's so different. And, you know, there are so many men and women thirsting after this man. And I think it's funny because it has, in this kind of like post-Me Too environment, you know, there are like young boys who are experimenting with how they want to present to the world, as every young person does. Like, it's a constant, you know, play with yourself and experimentation, like it constantly evolves. And I think having the biggest heartthrob in the world sort of as this new kind of
ambassador.
Yeah, aspirational thing. Like I have personally seen it because you know, with The Basement, it's a lot of straight men from 18 to 24, and I have seen that they are just more accepting of it, and they'll just try it, and they don't give a fuck anymore. And I was even saying to Josh earlier that, you know, if you were to look at a sort of high school comedy from the early 2000s, you wouldn't see them making videos of themselves wearing an outfit and putting it on TikTok. But like, there's just such a different attitude to it. And I think I have seen that, you know, they are so much more accepting, welcoming. And I do think that, you know, having Harry Styles, even Jacob Elordi, flirting on red carpets and all these kind of things, and yeah, it's just so different. And I do think that it's more interesting looking at what that means when you set that as like the aspiration for both men and women.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think, look, like, my jokes aside, I think that it would be silly to argue that Harry Styles, who is perhaps like one of the greatest, most high-profile matinee idols, if you can call him that, of our like latter stage, I think he's shifted the Overton window in terms of what is acceptable for men to wear, or what is normal for men to wear, what is not outside of the bounds of expectation, and whether or not you think that, like, you know, the job that he's done is subversive or like groundbreaking or interesting, like simply by being that high profile and challenging the status quo even a little bit. And I think that he's challenged it considerably, whether or not like it matches with your taste. I think that, like, you know, you can say that he has done something of significant impact, but perhaps as impactful, perhaps even more impactful than someone like Bowie, who did not have the kind of like mass media like penetration that we have. Like, I've never seen like more men wear sequins since the Arturo look that he wore in the As It Was music video. I've seen like the sequins look that he wears on the carpet. Even the popularity of brands like Paloma Spain are a direct result. And I also think Harry Lambert has like plenty of credit to take for the direction. He's the man behind the man, and I feel like that's
a queer.
Yeah, and exactly. And I feel like you cannot talk about Harry Styles without talking about Harry Lambert. You know.
I wonder if it worked. You know, they saw it working, and it's like, okay, this is it.
And they went for it.
If you, even Lil Nas X is the opposite example as someone who is out. I feel like they're very expressive with their outfits, but they get critiqued way harsher. Yeah. So there's an intersectionality to all of that conversation, you know?
Absolutely.
Like what the difference between Lil Nas X and Harry Styles, like sexuality, race, everything that comes into it is
given more freedom. Like that answer is glaringly obvious to me.
And I think that even circles back to who are the queer designers that are getting the spotlight that they're getting, or getting the backing that they're getting from fashion in the industry. And unfortunately, it tends to be white gays.
The taste level of this, though, I'm sorry. Take off the screen, please.
So what do we want to see more in menswear? What direction do we want to see it go in? I think we can see it going in a direction that I think none of us are loving.
I love a suit and tie, don't get me wrong. I do.
I think there's space for everything, isn't there? Which is coming back to the quote earlier by Magliano, which is that there needs to be more different types of representation of different types of people, and that it's not about narrowing it down, but broadening the visibility of different kinds of people, different kinds of men, different kinds of masculinity and femininity together, and that's what I would say.
I think there's a view of femininity in there too, because there's also almost like, if you flip the script and look at Billie Eilish, for example, who chose to wear oversized clothes and didn't want to sexualize themselves for the kind of patriarchal male gaze, they got so much backlash. Why are you hiding your body? You're insecure. You're this. There's a lot of but there's a power to the way that Billie did it. It's like, I'm controlling how you view me, and there's a more masculine take on that as well, And even like micro trends, I think due to TikTok and social media, micro trends happen so much more now. One that is a big one in a more feminine world is the bloke core aesthetic, which is taking like working class or like football culture or sportswear and then being feminine, but making it and then wearing it as like oversized and making little skirts. And I think it's a really interesting take on femininity taking from masculinity as well. And for me, I love to see this, and I love to see the younger generation kind of taking this on board and being so fluid. And that's, to me, what I hope Harry Styles being on the cover of Vogue wearing a dress can do. Open up the doors to fluidity across the board. Like you said, there's something for everyone.
Amy, working with the Basement and that very specific demographic of younger, straight... men. Looking at Magliano and SS Daley, do you see that really entering their zeitgeist?
Yeah, it's super interesting you say that, because I think whenever we do see certain collections, it's always like, is it actually something you'd see out in your day-to-day? And I think, especially with Magliano, I think that, there is more education in these groups. I think that, social media has really democratized what fashion is. It's allowed them to find community around these interests and not make it, a feminine interest. And even if it was, there's nothing wrong with that either. And I think I've definitely seen they just have more appreciation for tailoring, for history, for the storytelling. I could so see these kind of looks sort of filtering through. I feel like with SS Daley, I think it's just more fantasy, isn't it? Like, I can see this, like, at the Standard at a party or something, like 100%. But, like, on the streets, I think that maybe not as much, but definitely with Magliano, I really can. I can see it because, more than anything, it's just really beautifully made clothes. And it just is something that I think that...
Level of access.
Yeah, and I think the younger generation do have access to community and to education on these platforms to really like take any of that stigma that used to be in there completely out of it.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah, I
love it.
So the only thing I completely agree. I think that like I've been thinking a lot recently about just like the archetypes and even like sort of the Regency era dandy. And I think that like fundamentally perhaps the difference is I think the SS Daley versus I think he makes clothes for a kind of dandy. And I think that like for a long time, I think that fashion actually is trending towards this sort of reimagination of the dandy, in which I think that Harry Styles is a kind of transitional figure between like an Oscar Wilde figure and like what we're arriving at, this modern man. And I think that that's ultimately who he's making clothes for, the fops and the dandies, the people who love camp, but also love ceremony and also and pomp and bows and things to be formalized, but also to be slightly whimsical. And I feel like that's the direction we're tending towards. Because I think that I think that we're heading towards a more masculinized, but it's masculinized, but I also think that like ostensibly has these like very queer-coded elements, these things that remind me of Forster and Wilde and of Noel Coward. And I feel like that's perhaps where the real like queer element is coming out in like the direction that the fashion is taking. But yes, these are perhaps not day clothes that like the everyday working man would wear down the street. You have to be insulated from the kind of like violences and the kind of like harassment that comes with subverting these expectations, or you have to have paparazzi trained on you and a crowd of adoring followers. There needs to be some sort of barrier if you want, like for the most part, in expressing yourself in this way.
I think the interesting thing, we look at this collection and we think it's a very specific person who can wear it and consume it. But with a platform like Pitti and the amount of buyers who go there, this is all going to trickle down into Zara, into Weekday, into everything. And there's going to be the fast fashion interpretation of both Magliano and SS Daley, I'm assuming. And from that interpretation, I think that's where the ideas of menswear will really shift.
But it is interesting because I have seen on TikTok, I can't remember what the exact trending sound is, but it's something where all the boys that, like to dress up and put their outfits on TikTok, and it's something like, if you don't look like a granddad, or if you don't have this or this, then your outfit's mid. And it's so funny because they do, whilst you were saying that, I'm like, I can actually see the SS Daley trickling down. Like, it's already going in that direction of that more whimsical. And I think men are now they're now understanding that if someone doesn't like your outfit or comments on your outfit, then it's probably good because they don't understand it. And I think that there is, now that you say, I do think it just takes a bit more time. But once again, if you just look at how things were even 2 years ago, you can see that things do shift.
It speeds up so quick now.
It speeds up so quickly.
Depop actually, for example, released their trend predictions for 2024. And one of them actually was about Gen Z. And it was something like 1 out of 5 Gen Zers want to find their own core aesthetic. So create their own definition of what that is. And to me, that's quite queer. That's kind of queer coded in a sense of finding your own identity through multi different trends, perhaps, So I'll be interested to see how it plays out. But I definitely think things like social media play a massive part nowadays in the speed in which we see things change.
I think for people who are frustrated by seeing Harry Styles wearing a dress, which I'm not one of them actually, I agree with what you were saying earlier, which is, I think it's about representation of different identities, but I think the frustration comes from the idea of that visual identity being no longer queer, no longer being the outsider, but becoming mainstream, becoming in high street shops, and a feeling of that identity being taken and appropriated. Again, like you were saying, I don't think that's a problem, but I do also understand the sense of losing an individuality or a uniqueness, I suppose.
And I guess all of this is happening against this sort of backdrop where there are figures like Andrew Tate, and there is also this growing alt-right that is trying to sort of debase everything that this is for. And it's tough because if this is just a trend and it's okay for a year, but then everyone can retreat back if it does have this massive U-turn, because you never know, there is some really horrible discourse at the same time that's terrifying. And the amount of rights that are being rolled back, I can totally understand that this also could be something that people just pile in on and then just immediately run back from if it does become dangerous again. And we just don't know, because as much as we want to think it is becoming more progressive and accepting, Andrew Tate is horrifying and some of the things that are said, and there are a lot of people that listen to him.
With Gucci, it's changed now. It's no longer,
so quickly.
And it's that idea of what's at stake, I think.
Masculinity feels like there's, I think certain people feel like it's been threatened because of little elements of femininity, and ultimately it comes down to from a male gaze point of view, femininity is sexy and it's desired and it's lustful, but on a man it's weak, because actually what it is masculine is seen as the power and the dominance, and anything that's feminine is seen as weaker, and I think as queer people being kind of toying the gap of both, and I think you can even see that with drag. So the idea of what drag was kind of the original definition, I guess, was a man dressed up as a woman and performative. But it's so much different nowadays. But not everyone can get their head around that. So it's now there's trans performers, drag kings. It's not about your gender. It's about your expression. But that the world hasn't caught up with the evolution of drag, and that's, I feel like, I guess it comes down to queerness always kind of doing things ahead.
I was going to end our conversation with a question on whether we think Magliano or SS Daley are going to be really influential figures in how masculinity and menswear is shaped. But I mean, after our conversation, I think it could go either way, right? Again, masculinity is so in flux. Menswear has its archetypes that it'll revisit over and over again. How that presents itself, we don't know. That's all I had. Thank you guys for tuning in to SHOWstudio's live panel discussion on Pitti Uomo's guest designers this year. Thank you to my lovely panelists, and head to SHOWstudio for more Fashion Week coverage.